It's like, I've asked some experts and now I'm going to ask you. I love that.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
And today we're going to throw some unseen questions at each other as we try to get to the bottom of some of the most frequently asked questions of the TDAPE regulars. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
So in previous episodes, or in a previous episode, I mentioned that I had been reading a text from, or a research paper from 1999 by Balin et al. Called something like Common Misconceptions of Critical Thinking. It's one of these papers that I really like. It speaks to a range of issues. I think it gets to the heart of a lot of the misconceptions behind the skills, knowledge, debate, etc. And I was delighted to realize something that I'd missed from this, which is that it is part one of kind of two parts that were originally presented together. So I had the chance to read part two this week, which goes beyond describing these misconceptions. And as this part of the paper suggests, it conceptualizes critical thinking. The paper's title is Conceptualizing Critical Thinking. And it is a really wonderful follow-up to that first part, answers any of those questions that you might have and reinforces the initial understanding that you might take from the paper. So yeah, if you are interested in in people who have a position on things like comprehension and critical thinking and generic thinking skills that is a little more nuanced, or I think a little more nuanced, then this is a really good place to continue your learning. What about you, Kieran? What are you reading for?
So you could say you were going to part two like it's 1999.
Oh, goodness me. Yeah, you could. That's damn good. That's good stuff, sir.
Well, I spent the whole time that you were speaking thinking about that once you said it was from 1999 and trying to work it in. So I'm not 100% certain or convinced that I haven't got the first bit. I've got 2010 as it's Common Misconceptions of Critical Thinking, and it's by Balin, Gerald, Combs, and Daniels. Are they related to each other, or just
yeah? Like, so Common Misconceptions was originally, I think, obviously, perhaps originally published in 1999 and then updated in 2010. Perhaps I know that the version that I've got is certainly 1999, and the Conceptualizing Critical Thinking was also 1999. Thankfully, for the sake of your pun, it is those are both released in 1999. They have, by the sound of things, perhaps been updated since.
Right, yeah, because obviously after we did a research episode recently, I put a shout out for what are your papers you recommend people read, and I've been going through them, and that was one of them. That was like the fifth or sixth one that was recommended, and so what a coincidence that just happens to be the paper that I was reading this week. So not much more to say other than read part one and part two, and perhaps the updated 2010 version to see if there's any similarities and differences. So, summertime, we've got some questions coming in. We have questions coming in all the time, and it's fantastic. And some of them, I think, are big enough questions to include on the podcast and to share with others. I'll start, if that's okay, Chris. And because this one's reading based, so I might not have anything to really contribute to it. But it says, when I assess pupils' reading, what am I looking for? And how do I know that I'm assessing pupils properly? It's a bit easier in maths because the extent of numbers and what pupils can do with them is quite obvious to me. But I don't find this is true with reading. What would you recommend?
It's a difficult one, not least because, as you mentioned, compared to mathematics, a big part of reading comprehension, or a big part of understanding reading comprehension, is recognizing that this is an unimaginably vast domain. Yes, mathematics is huge, but you can pin down components of it that you're going to teach, and then you're going to check whether pupils have learned them. When it comes to reading comprehension, for example, what we are left with is an understanding of everything there is to know about written English and the world that it describes. So trying to say, I'm going to assess this or that or the other is always going to be quite difficult. That said, there are components behind reading comprehension that can be profitably assessed. So I think, first and foremost, every school needs to have an understanding of where pupils are at with regards to their journey to expert decoding, which might mean using things like the phonics screening check, but also crucially using the assessments that will be part of your school's chosen phonics program. So every pupil in the school, whether they are in reception or year 6, school needs to know where are they at on their journey to coding expertise. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to be looking at every single year 5 and checking their decoding. I think we can safely assume that when pupils have, for want of a better word, graduated from our phonics program at the end of, say, year 1 or year 2, that we can be comfortable that they're well on their path to expert decoding, and then we can start looking at fluency. So the second thing I'd start thinking about, on the assumption that pupils are capable with decoding individual words, is how are we assessing fluency? Now, generally that can be done through hearing pupils read aloud from an age-appropriate text, assessing words correct per minute, and getting a sense of prosody, whether kids are reading with what sounds akin to a natural spoken voice. I would say that you want to be tracking that for every pupil across the school, and the only point at which you might stop doing that was when it was absolutely clear that a pupil was a relatively fluent reader. So if they're reading past, say, 120 words correct per minute, it sounds like a natural spoken voice, they can pick up pretty much any age-appropriate text and read it aloud fairly well. That's the point at which you might say, you know what, we don't need to assess this pupil's fluency every 6 months or whatever it might be anymore. So assessing decoding, I'd say when it comes to assessing fluency, you want to do that maybe 2 or 3 times a year. Seems like a sensible balance between what you want to know and the impediments that are put in our way through having to undertake these assessments. I would also say that there is some value in some kind of comprehension assessment, a standardized comprehension assessment. Now, the nature of these things is they're not great when it comes to analyzing particular barriers to reading. It's tempting to look at a standardized comprehension assessment and say, oh, this kid struggled on a question that required inference, so I need to teach them how to infer. But actually, these assessments, they're not valuable for that, really. They basically give you a little taste of all sorts of areas of reading. It's perfectly possible that a pupil might struggle with a comprehension assessment because of issues with decoding or fluency or vocabulary or text structure knowledge or whatever it might be. However, the value that these kind of assessments do provide is that they can give you a sense across a school of how reading is going. Over time, a number of assessments can give you a general idea of whether a pupil is perhaps where we would hope them to be in their reading development relative to their peers, which can be a valuable thing. But as I say, you wouldn't want to use them to be identifying and addressing particular reading barriers. In short, I think if you are assessing pupils' decoding development, especially in reception in year 1 and year 2, using your school's phonics program assessments, maybe using the phonics screening check and the follow-up check in year 1 and year 2. If you are assessing fluency 2 or 3 times a year, and also if 2 or 3 times a year you're using a standardized comprehension assessment, I think those 3 things together give you a pretty systematic approach to assessment. And then the challenge is how you use what you find from those assessments to inform your interventions. But that's, perhaps a whole podcast on its own for another day.
Nice. I think really clear. I mean, obviously, I think lots of that stuff, as you're saying, I've obviously heard you talk about this before. We must have close to 10 hours just solely with you and I talking about reading available. But it's nice to be able to point someone in the direction of here's the 2 minutes. Because I know that people will be asking themselves, I mean, I certainly would be asking myself this question if I were teaching reading in the classroom. So I think that'd be really helpful, Chris. Thank you.
No worries. I mean, just one other caveat I might add to that is that reading is complex. It is intimately connected to a pupil's spoken language development as well. So while these kinds of assessments are really valuable for everyone across the school, you also want to have an open line of communication with your special educational needs and disabilities coordinator, your SENCO, in other words, so that you can be working out whether there are other barriers to reading development that some of the pupils might face that might need slightly more specialist support. So, my chance to ask you a question then. Now, I hope you forgive me that I've got 3 questions for you. I'm just going to ask one of them now. One of them is a little more personal, but I know it's the sort of thing that I get asked quite a lot, and I think you might have a unique perspective on it. You, like me, spent a lot of time working as a classroom teacher, working in schools, and have quite recently taken the step to do some work kind of outside of the public sector. And I'm interested in your take on what are kind of the advantages and disadvantages of such a move. How do you feel about it? What do you think you've gained? What do you think you've lost? Interested in your take on this.
Very good question. I mean, it's almost been a year since I stopped working in one school. I think I get to do quite a lot of the things that I used to do, working across different schools. Certainly some of the bigger trusts that we work with, I'll deliver face-to-face CPD, so I still get quite a lot of face-to-face contact. But I think lots of the things that I can do, or the benefits, are things that I actively think that teachers should be able to do too. Mm-hmm. For instance, I can do the school run every day without worry. But I don't see why that shouldn't be the case for everyone. So I like the flexibility they have. I can drop the boys off at school. I can make sure they do their homework in the morning or the evening. I pick them up. And so I've got a bit of time, more time with the boys than I would have had were I doing the typical school leader role that I was doing. So things like that. I mean, I haven't taken massive holidays during term time, but I've taken the odd day here and there and gone to things on a Friday that in the past I wouldn't have been able to. I mean, at my own stag do, I turned up not a day, maybe at 11 p.m. of the first day because I had to do a full day's work on the Friday and then fly from Gatwick to Germany. So things like that, I have the flexibility to do. And then also, I think perhaps it might be the situation that I find myself in, but I'm in a position where I'm talking to people who I think know more about mathematics teaching than I do. And so I feel like I'm growing as a professional, but also seeing how a different part of the economic sphere works, because if you've only ever worked in a school, you've got one insight. Me for the first 16 years of my career, I'd worked in supermarkets and things like that before, but I'd never really been on the business end of those places. Whereas now I'm seeing what life is like with a different sort of, I don't know, not reflection, but when the lens is different, so to speak. But these are things that I think that teachers should have the capacity to do themselves too. So part of me thinks we'll keep campaigning for that. I definitely think I'll go back into school. Part of my shtick is that whenever I'm out of touch with the profession, that's when it's time to go back into class, because there are far too many in a position of perceived power with quite a big disconnect between what they're saying, what they're promoting, and what the actual, the experience is like on the ground. I think I've still got that. It's only been 12 months. My wife's a teacher. I still understand the difficulties, and particularly the difficulties in 2023, because it felt like as we went 21, 22, things were just getting tougher and tougher in schools. And so I think that cause needs to be championed. But there are lots of similarities between what I do now and what I used to do. I've got the chance to look at big projects, to support schools that need or want to develop their teaching of mathematics. So there's a lot of overlap, but just a slightly better work-life balance because of the freedoms that I'm allowed. And I don't know, I don't take advantage, or not take advantage, but I don't, it's not like I'm taking weeks off in the middle of term, but those couple of hours either side of 9 to 3 make a big difference for my family. So, I mean, that's where I come down. But I love working with pupils. I love being in schools. When you get good at something, why not continue to do it? We always say, but if you get really good at teaching, why do you want to become a school leader? Well, it's because of the remuneration. But if there were a way that you could be a really good teacher, I would do that. But I think for my career, this is what was necessary, because then I got to spend time with people like Johnny Hall, talking about manipulatives, because, the last 12 months, my thinking about those has grown massively, and things that I wrote in Thinking Deeply about Primary Mathematics, he's all, well, why do you think this? And why do you think that? And so at the time, so for me, it was the right move in terms of in my own development. But I definitely see a time where I go back in, because, when you're good at something, why not do it?
Great answer. Really interesting stuff. I know there are lots of people in education who are, interested in other opportunities kind of that are directly connected to education, like you are, that are slightly different to working in a school. So I thought that some people might be interested in that. One of the key things I've noticed in the 18 months that I've not had like my own class in effect, or my own school where I work in every day, has just been the difference in like emotional intensity. The nature of being a teacher and being a school leader is that it just feels hugely emotionally intense. It's a bit like it reminds me of standing on like the front row of a Mogwai gig. It's just the volume is just constant, and you get used to it, and it's only when you're somewhere else that you realize that maybe things don't need to be quite so loud. And the job that I do now doesn't have anything like that emotional intensity. I don't have really, really terrible days. I don't have probably the same incredibly exhilarating days either that I had as a teacher, but that's the central difference for me, like a modulating of the emotional intensity that I had working in schools. Same as you, I want to go back as well at some point, but it's not going to be easy, I would have thought.
I mean, there's definitely a teacher shortage, so
yeah,
just say we want to teach.
and I live in Peterborough. It's of all the places where people struggle to find, like, even when there wasn't a teacher shortage massively, it was still not the most difficult place to find a teaching job, partly because I think, unless I'm mistaken, it's one of the biggest cities in the country that doesn't have a university, or it's about to sort of have a university, but hasn't for a long time, which means that lack of graduates, lack of teachers generally. So yeah, I'd imagine I'll be able to get back into the profession sooner rather than later.
I mean, also the fact that you're a very good teacher as well, Chris, so...
Well, maybe. Maybe. I hope so. I like to think so. I like to think I'm half decent. But one thing I guarantee, I guess this is a perspective on it as well. I guarantee if the first few weeks of going back in the classroom, I'd be bad at it. It would take me a while to, get back up to speed, I think. Like in little moments, I like to think I'd still be my old self, but I think it'd be a long time. Or at least a few weeks before I felt completely natural in the classroom again.
Yeah, there's so many things you take for granted that are just like micro behaviors that you once you remember to go, oh, silly me, why didn't I do that from the start? But well, it'd be interesting to see. We could document that, so we could, because obviously within the next 20 years of the podcast, you'll have to come back in.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be quite a lot of fun.
So my next one, Chris, I've already asked some experts about this, but I think it's one of those ones where I'd like to take a range of opinions, and so this question will probably get asked quite a lot.
It's like, I've asked some experts, and now I'm going to ask you. I love that. I love that. No, that is I'm sure I'm about to learn, is a fairly accurate framing. Go on. Sorry.
I think you've got the self-confidence to realize when different areas aren't your strengths.
I'm looking forward to this now. This is definitely something I know very little about. I mean, there's a whole range of subjects where this could be, but yeah, go for it. Dive in.
I mean, let's just say no one's paying £2,000 for Chris Such to come in and talk about this topic.
No one's paying £2,000 for Chris Such to talk about any topic. I can assure you of that.
How can I effectively integrate technology into my classroom?
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Yeah. How can I effectively integrate technology? Well, the first point of view I would give on this is I don't think there's a right way to do this. I'm full of bad analogies at the moment, so bear with me for another one. I was watching a video about football penalty taking the other day, and someone said one of the key things about, expert penalty takers, if you look at them from player to player to player to player, is that there isn't a good way to take penalties. It depends on, the player's individual, preferences. So some players like to hammer it in the top corner, some like to dink it, etc., etc. What matters is matching what you do to your own comfort, what matches your sense of expertise. I think the same is true in the classroom. I think when it comes to technology, some people absolutely love tech and are brilliant at integrating it and can do it seamlessly. And other people, perhaps a bit more like me, I love a visualizer. I'm more than happy to use digital manipulatives. I find them really valuable. Perfectly, happy working my way around an interactive whiteboard or the equivalent, digital screen. It's all screens are digital. You know what I mean? The ones that are like the ones that are popular in schools now that are basically just a great big iPad on a wall, which have their pros and cons from my experience. So my first tip is, in effect, do what you're comfortable with. Don't feel like you have to incorporate every flash thing that you see. Second bit of advice would be, however, do consider a visualizer. I mean, they are unbelievably... There are so many things that I now think that I just couldn't teach effectively without a visualizer. I think teaching handwriting, as much as you can do that on an interactive whiteboard, often you can't have everyone in the room seeing what you're doing, whereas you can model process and product under a visualizer more effectively, at the same time as modeling how to hold, actual pencil. Modeling things like how to use a protractor. Again, trying to teach that in the days. Yes, there are, again, sort of, I was about to say digital manipulatives, the sort of thing I mean, like the interactive whiteboard resources that you can find that do a sort of job, but they're nowhere near as instructive as I think as doing that. So first thing, consider a visualizer. First thing was go your own way. Second, consider a visualizer. That's probably about as far as my expertise stretches. I was never a great one for a lot of technology in the classroom. Actually, no, there's one thing I would say, thinking about the advice that my partner's given to me. Consider, if you're, this is something that you're potentially into, consider the use of an iPad or a tablet of some kind as a way, instead of a visualizer, as a way of modeling around the room. The ability to take this and just take a photo of a pupil's work and immediately project it onto a screen, I think is a really valuable thing. Again, you can do that with a visualizer. You can, pick it up and take it away, but the ease with which you can then annotate it anywhere else around the room. So consider having a bit of a play with something like Microsoft, I think it's called OneNote. I've seen used in classrooms really effectively. OneNote and a tablet, those things can be paired up really well. So actually, last bit of advice linked to kind of connects all this stuff together. From my experience, now, if you're willing to do so, summer holidays or Christmas holidays or Easter is a great time to just take an hour, go into school. If you're going to introduce new technology and you want to make it part of your lessons, have a play with it, have a trial run with it outside of, don't let the first time you have a go with stuff be in front of kids. I know it sounds like an obvious thing, but I've certainly been there. If you're going to use a bit of tech, make sure you've had a trial run, ideally with a colleague somewhere in the room so they can see that you're using it properly from the perspective of a kid in the corner of the room, but trial it out when there's zero pressure so that you really know what you're doing, because you know what it's like. those transitions, when you're going from, oh, okay, I'm going to switch over to the visualizer now so we can see this. If you've got a class of 30 kids and they're, maybe they're slightly bouncy, it's the start of the year, and those transitions aren't smooth and they're taking time, they can feel like, like hours, those transitions, if they're a little bit too long. So yeah, perhaps take some time to rehearse this stuff in a zero pressure environment.
I think that's really good advice. I think visualizers, you can get them for as cheap as £20. And I know they're not high quality, high spec, but they're sufficient. An image on the screen is an image on the screen at the end of the day. And I mean, I would have a similar approach to the one I have at home, because there's so many things I see and go, oh, I'd like to buy that. But then I sit myself down and go, well, what is the reason for this purchase? And I just make a list of the reasons why. And by the end of that process, I've normally talked myself out of it, or I've convinced myself that actually this is something. So, it's almost like, it's not means testing, because means testing obviously has a very specific economic definition, but it's like purpose testing. What's the benefit of this going to be, or do I hope it will be? And then, does that offset the cost? Because there will normally be quite a large cost, and it has to enhance your teaching or the learning of the pupils. Otherwise, then it's probably a luxury.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I mean, I guess kind of linked to that is when I first used a visualizer in the classroom, I was tempted just to buy one because it wasn't something that we had across the school. And before I did, a teacher said to me, "Oh, I've got a spare. Do you want to have have a trial run before you commit to it?" It was only a Hue HD, so sort of 50 quid one. It wasn't like one of the better brands. I'm sure maybe Hue do good ones as well.
Yeah,
but these ones
I'm looking forward to this court case.
Yeah, sorry, Hue.
Sorry to all the people at Hue.
Hue HD cams are perfectly decent. I'm an IPvo man. I do like an IP. Yeah, cut this stuff. It's going to sound like an advert. I wish I got money from IP. I would happily have free visualizers from IPvo. But yeah, if you have the opportunity, I think having a bit of a play with something before you commit to it is an ideal thing to do. Or another way of doing that, if you buy something or you invest in something that you think, yeah, this might benefit my teaching, keep the receipt. You might realize after a week that actually this isn't for you. It doesn't enhance your practice in the way that you'd hoped it would. And, you haven't really lost as much if you just return it. So yeah, don't be afraid. I guess one other thing, there's always one person in your school who really is au fait with this stuff, in my experience. There's usually one person who is just, a whiz with technology. Go and speak to them. Go and get some advice about, how you're going to get stuff to work in your classroom if you've decided to commit to it. Don't be afraid to take advice would be my advice.
Yeah, I mean, unless they're too busy changing the digital camera memory cards, because that's normally what the person who's au fait with technology gets to do. If people still
there's always that case. They often tend to, you go in there and they'll, before you say anything else, they're like, there's 3 laptops from the laptop trolley still missing. I labeled these in September. How is 3, 7, and 9 still not there? I'm like, sorry. Yeah, it's yeah, so maybe that's a bit of advice. If you're, funnily enough, someone said to me when my first job in teaching, someone said to me, like, do you play any musical instruments? I said, I play guitar a bit. I can't play the piano or anything like that. And they said, if you do, don't tell anyone because you will be roped in to doing this stuff in public unless you are very confident with this stuff and really want to. Don't let anyone know these particular musical talents you have. In my case, talent would very much have been an overstatement, but the point stands.
I don't know. I've seen you play guitar before, and you are quite talented, Chris. Yeah, was it pulling a Suchmo to underestimate your capacity for various things?
Yeah, well, any vague capability that I may have had is long in the past now. We might have had a discussion along these lines before, but I don't think I've ever got your clear answer on it. So I'm gonna push you on it. I want you to imagine, it's a hypothetical scenario. You are staffing a 1-form entry school, and it has Let's say, for the sake of argument, we're talking year 1 to year 6. So this is a school that it has a reception, but the reception teacher has been really experienced, knows what they're doing, absolutely loves it there. And so really you're just looking at what teachers are going where in year 1 to 6. Now, of these 6 teachers in your one form entry school, to the best of your understanding, 4 of them are, where you want them to be, perfectly capable, etc., happy to work in any year group. And then you have 2 other teachers, one who is really new to the profession and is still coming to terms with the basics, and one teacher who is, as far as you can tell, basically a wizard, just an incredible teacher, knows subject knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, ability to develop relationships with kids, etc., as good as it can be. The question's this: what year groups are the 4 kind of average teachers like me? Where are they going? Where is the relatively new, kind of somewhat struggling teacher going? Which year group are you putting them into, and what year group are you putting your wizard into?
Oh, brilliant question. Yeah, because I'm sure any discussion of this in the past would have mentioned how context specific it is and things. How long have I been at the school? Am I brand new, or am I
you have
head?
Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you have been at the school long enough, you've developed enough trust, etc., that wherever you put these teachers, wherever you ask them to work, they will understand your decision. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that your assessments of these teachers' capabilities are accurate. Obviously, there's massive caveats here. In the real world, it's very, very difficult to get any sense of certainty about the capabilities of individual teachers. Though we do, you do generally get a sense of different teachers' strengths and weaknesses. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that you've been there a while and your assessments of these teachers' capabilities is pretty accurate.
Cool. So then you get your 4 who can all be grouped together. And I think they're going in 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm going to put my newish teacher in 6. I'm going to put my wizard in 1. And I'll explain, because if I've been there long enough, the expectation should be then that most of year 6 is a revision year. And you will have covered, hopefully the pupils will have learned the vast majority of what they'll be assessed against at the end of the year, but also what you've outlined in your curricula. So in an ideal world, there's no pressure in 6. And so I can put them in there with the pupils who are most likely to conform on a social level. I don't know, not true for all year 6 classes, but they can normally spot when a teacher's insecure and will often give them leeway, I find. They understand that, this is a person with a job. They understand what jobs are. I'm not saying that younger kids can't. I'm not saying that younger kids don't want to conform, but I find that level of empathy in many year 6 classes. So I think in there would be a really good experience. Plus, it's probably the content that they're most familiar with. So the mathematics, even on a procedural level, they will be comfortable, you'd hope, with that. And if not, can become really quite quickly. I've got my wizard in 1, because if they've got this established reception teacher and then they've got a fantastic year 1 teacher, that makes year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, year 6 so much more easily managed. And so even though the maths on the surface involves smaller numbers, the pedagogy you need to teach it is vastly more complex, I think, in my opinion, in my experience. And so I would want to make sure that whoever's in there is doing the absolute best job possible, because year 1, there's a big expectation in the formal nature of education in many schools. Pupils can struggle with that. So really what you need is someone who understands how to get the most from these pupils, but while keeping them safe and in a comfortable zone, if that makes sense, because ultimately they're going to get tired more easily. they're going to be learning things that are really going to stretch their understanding of the world. And I think that needs to be managed very carefully, because otherwise they can become disengaged. So I go for strength. I might always say I go for strength earlier on, but I'm putting my money where my mouth is in this imaginary school. But I do think it's easier if I've been the person who's been there for longer. Because there will be circumstances when you go into a school and it's a quick win to get a better set of SATs results to buy yourself some time. I don't think head teachers should need that. We don't have enough head teachers, and we need to keep the good ones we do have. But I understand that that's a reality. That, okay, I'm going to put my strongest teachers in year 6 this year. I'm going to build up, and those year 1s coming through in 6 years will be in a stronger place. But you really need to go. I mean, most governing bodies will support you and follow the head teacher as long as you've got a clear plan. But, if you're accountable to a trust or a local authority, you're at the behest of their understanding of school development. And while I think more people talk about the idea of school development as a long journey, and certainly the most sensible trusts and the most sensible local authorities see it that way, I know a lot of head teachers who feel like the local authority or the trust are breathing down their neck when the SATs results come in, or they're anxious before the 7th-ish of July, whenever the results come out. But we were talking a second ago about how there's a shortage of teachers. There's also a shortage of head teachers, and reportedly many head teachers are leaving the profession, and I don't blame them after the pandemic and the stress that brought on, because essentially you had the whole weight of your community on your shoulders. So we need to make sure that the really good ones stay in place. And yeah, we should have the confidence to say, okay, things might not change overnight. And when we make changes, things might get worse before they get better. But in the long run, more children have a better education. So that I would go with my gut, because I'm long enough in the tooth to not really care what other people think. And so I just say, if you guys want the outcomes you want, we're going to do it this way. If not, get someone else to do it. But I do understand that that's not the reality for everyone, and that circumstances do dictate where you put your teachers. But what I certainly wouldn't do is put my weakest teacher in year 3, because it's the year 1 of Key Stage 2. It's like, okay, we'll keep these teachers as far away from year 6 as possible. Place value, if I have my maths head on, place value just explodes. The idea of proportional reasoning explodes, multiplicative reasoning. I want a solid teacher in there, a solid 3-4, and you've mopped up what 30% of the SATs if you're quantifying things in those terms. So that's where I would go.
Interesting. I mean, I've thought about this since formulating the question, and I honestly don't know where I'd come down. I think cynically, or just pragmatically, is probably a better way of putting it. Sometimes you're right. There are situations where you just think, I do need, as a school leader, we need a good set of SATs results this year in order to free up the pressure for us to be able to do sensible things over the longer term. Should be that way, but in a lot of cases, I can understand why it is. I think the other maybe way of thinking about this, because I think generally I agree with you, I might be tempted to put the slightly weaker teacher in year 5 because of the challenge of the transition for kids emotionally at the end of year 6 can sometimes be really difficult. It depends on the characters in year 6, I guess. One other argument, I mentioned this idea to someone else, and they said, oh, well, I'd think of those two as a team. I would make sure that whatever happened, I'd have the really strong teacher the year after the really weak teacher. It wouldn't matter whether it was 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, but I would know that, you might have some challenges. You might have parents who feel like their kids didn't get the greatest deal in the world, perhaps with this slightly weaker teacher, and knowing that the year that came after was going to be, top notch, might be something that would make you feel better about that. So yeah, I don't think, obviously there's not a right answer to this question. It's just, I think, an interesting way to explore people's views on education.
Yeah, I mean, I did consider a job share where they split the class. I mean, if they're an ECT, it might be possible, but if they're further, maybe year 3, less possible, I think, within current budgets. I mean, year 5 is an interesting one from a maths perspective. There's some maths in year 5 that pupils might not encounter again until year 9. And really, I think it's actually the most interesting part of the maths curriculum in terms of Key Stage 2. And I would make sure that you had a solid teacher in there because, for instance, you're exploring multiplication, scaling, different ideas about the calculations with fractions. And
I was about to say, fractions goes crazy in year 5. Suddenly I mean, at the heart of it all, not heart of it all, but at the heart of a lot of it is kids being really, really comfortable with the idea of equivalent fractions. You get that nailed and a lot of that falls into place. But yeah, there's so much fraction stuff in year 5. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was essentially it. And I think the same is true perhaps across the rest of the curriculum. I mean, you'd want your pupils to be in the position when, in terms of reading and writing, you'd want them to be pretty fluent readers, hopefully in year 3 and year 4 maybe, but definitely by the end of year 5. And you'd want to be making slight tweaks to their prose when you're in year 6. So a lot of the grammatical stuff I would want tied up, so these pupils are pretty fluent. I'm trying to think of history. Sometimes you will find you've got your, the study where you have the potential to study Mesoamerica. And so you're going beyond the sphere of where you might have been before. But I'm always thinking from a maths perspective, really.
Yeah. I struggle not to think about in terms of reading and mathematics as my first loves.
So this one links to a few of our recent chats, Chris. It says, I find it really difficult to keep track of all the new and exciting things I should be reading about. How can I stay up to date with the latest educational research and trends?
The first thing I might push back on is the need to kind of keep up to date. I think some of the most valuable stuff that I've read and that I do read is 10, 20 years old in some cases. I don't think it's really possible to kind of, as it were, to keep up to date. I mean, a useful thing to do if you are that way inclined, get on Twitter or Threads, follow people who are interested in research, and you will, people will send stuff your way. You will find stuff, but stuff is always going to, slip through the gaps. I'd say one of the disadvantages almost of this idea of keeping up to date is that there is perhaps a tendency to overvalue the recent stuff, that kind of in the way that all of us are prone to. It's a bit like books, films, etc. If something is still, considered to be really good and it was made or written in, 2000, then there's a really decent chance that it is worth your time. Whereas something can have quite a lot of buzz and excitement and it be from yesterday. And, maybe it's really important, maybe it's really valuable, or maybe it's just exciting and new. So I'd push back a little bit on the idea of having to keep up to date. But if you are that way inclined, I think the best way is some kind of use of social media, be it edu-Twitter or Threads or other options. I was about to say Facebook, probably not Facebook from my experience. What else? I would say that a decent way of looking at things is if you've got an area of interest, say like I have, I'm particularly interested in research into literacy, then one way of doing things is to look at the options around Google Scholar in terms of, researchers you're interested in, notifications that you can receive. I can't honestly say that I've set anything up like that. I kind of rely on my Twitter network for that kind of stuff. But there are options through Google Scholar. But if in doubt, first, I wouldn't worry too much about keeping up to date as such. I'd be more interested in what areas of research are currently influencing pedagogical discourse, and often these things are a little bit older. But to the extent that I would be trying to keep up to date, social media is the way forward, I think.
Yeah, I always remember Amy Bill saying she like reads like 3 or 4 things about the same topic at the same time. Probably makes sense to, yeah, find out what you're interested in, start from there, and then that sort of those things you read at the same time branch out on off of each other. Yeah, I agree. I do use Google Scholar to give me notifications, primarily variation theory. But as I've said before in the podcast, there are 2 types of variation theory. There's like this advanced mathematical concept. So I get lots of things for that, which I had to delete. And also it's on American time. So I will often get 3 a.m. emails. So I think I may need to go back and check and see if there's like a monthly setting where I can get this month in review kind of thing. Because for my studies as well, I've got certain things set up and it's constant. Too many for me to keep track of. So I don't know if it's a beginner level activity, but definitely worth doing if you want new stuff and you want to see what people are doing. And Neil and I have been using this app, and I think the free version, the only difference is you can't save them. It's called Lit Maps, and basically you put in a seed paper and it will show you the tree that comes from that. So if you really do have an interest in a subject, go for there. I'm gonna try and make some YouTube videos on some of the stuff that I've seen from that, just so people can see how that like it's used. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it's impossible. There's so much going on, so I think you're right. The heart is decide what you're interested in and go from there.
Okay, for this question, I want to lean into your experiences of working and supporting teachers in schools. Now, the temptation here is to make this kind of maths focused, but I'm going to try and take a step back from that a little bit. In short, you've watched a lot of teachers. You've watched a lot of teachers doing their thing. Putting aside maths-specific pedagogy for a moment and just thinking about more general pedagogy, what would you say is the most common weakness or difficulty or area of development, whatever you want to call it, that teachers have that you see and think, actually, if you're going to work on one area, make it that? What would you say is the most common thing that you see that you'd want teachers to work on?
New teachers or just teachers in general?
Good question. Let's go new teachers, and then let's say teachers and relatively new teachers and relatively experienced teachers. Because funnily enough, as soon as you said that, I sort of developed a slightly different answer, my own version of the answer to this question. But yeah, so let's say relatively new teachers and relatively experienced teachers.
Cool. Because you're right. I have studied these patterns, and so spend a lot of time doing the same thing, working on the same things with people. You try and generalize, and I think if I haven't spoken about it on podcasts before or other podcasts, I think I may have written about it. But the almost guaranteed number one thing new teachers will do is play guess what's in my head. And that's because they don't yet understand that effective instruction is necessary, and it's almost like, I think I've described it as like a sense of liminality, because you're in between having been at school, and you may have done a short period of time where you've been trained to be a teacher, but then all of a sudden you're now expected to become the teacher, and you're only really drawing on your experience of being taught, and you're in no position to assess what effective teaching is when you're a student, I don't think. So you'll often find that there are lots of questions, but they're not necessarily focused questions or carefully chosen questions, and it takes more time than we perhaps have, or certainly is necessary, than careful instruction or modeling might be. And so I will see this 9 out of 10 times, probably even closer to 10 out of 10 times. I'll normally start my conversations with teachers I'm working with right, so we need to establish something like my turn, your turn, and explaining the thought process behind that. I think with more experienced teachers, I think there's less consistency, but I do think the purpose of practice is one that most teachers I work with spent time working with me on. And so the idea of, I've spoken to this before, replacing 30 questions with 6 carefully chosen questions so that I can really tease out the errors that pupils might be displaying. And I think that's true across most subjects, because you're saying you want me to think broader. But I do think, for instance, if we're looking at clauses, what is it about the clauses that the pupils don't understand? And so typically you'll have like fill in the blanks, or you'll rearrange this so that it makes sense, or put the comma in the right place. Choosing 6 of those really carefully will help us ascertain what is it you don't understand about the creation of a subordinate clause, or why is it that you're creating these comma splices, and so, it's the purpose of practice. Is it something that we're just doing to keep the pupils occupied, or because that's what we've always done? And so I'll quite often spend time thinking about, how can we ensure that the questions we set our pupils take us to the next bit? But I don't know, it's probably more difficult to say that of experienced teachers, because I think the variability is much greater. But just in my experience, and I can speak to my experience, with a reasonable amount of confidence, that's where a lot of my time will be spent. And I think it's an advanced place to spend your time thinking. It's not the nuts and bolts of teaching, but it's essential if we want to take our practice to the next level. And there would have been a point where I've been teaching for quite a while where I became aware that this was something worth doing, and realized that, it would have been better if I've been doing this for a long time. So it's not me saying I've always known this, because I've spoken on the podcast about how bad I was at teaching for, certainly the start of my career anyway.
I think that idea of purpose of practice is really telling. I couldn't help but think about a conversation I had when I first started being in a position to support other teachers. I remember watching a teacher, I think it would have been year 5. And generally speaking, I think really doing a really good job, but had a really fascinating conversation. They were doing some kind of revision of multiplying by 10, 100, and 1,000. And obviously this is year 5, so they've been introduced to decimals, etc. And I noted that the practice that the kids were doing was all multiplying integers. And when I said, well, why haven't you included perhaps any decimals in there? The response that I got back was, well, they'll get them wrong. they'll get them wrong because they won't be able to. They'll just add a 0. At which point, I mean, it led to a really good conversation about, well, what is the purpose of this then? I mean, what is if you are able to go into autopilot while you're doing practice, then it isn't working. So yeah, I think that's I like that phrase. I think it does speak to a great deal of things that I've seen in the past. If you'll forgive me, as I've done throughout this podcast, because I can't resist doing so, I will answer my own question as well. I think so. The stuff I've seen, like with newish teachers, not waiting for silence when responding to when trying to just talk with a class, trying to explain something, thinking that 90% quiet is enough, and that leading to fairly significant issues down the line. I mean, you could just say, big box, basic ideas of behavior management, but that one in particular is often like a really common jumping off point for this stuff. With more experienced teachers, obviously loads of teachers do the stuff that I'm about to describe to an incredibly high standard. But if there's one thing that I pick up again and again, it's a lack of responsive teaching. I mean by that, they've planned a lesson, they know their stuff for this lesson, and there's almost no way that it can't go to plan. Like if your lesson can't go to plan, if there's no way that your lesson can't go to plan, then you're not being responsive enough. The best teachers I've ever seen, or at least the ones that in my estimation, were the best, so often after you saw their lessons, they said, well, I had planned to do this, but then I discovered that some of the children in the class didn't know this, and so we had to go in that direction. And so actually some of the stuff I was going to teach today, I'm now going to have to teach tomorrow. Or equally, I got 10 minutes in and realized that pretty much everyone in the class already could do the thing I was talking about today. So I had to, in effect, skip ahead to tomorrow's lesson because I'm not going to waste 50 minutes on stuff that they're really confident with when I can build their understanding. So like generally, I know it's a bit vague, but perhaps not having the confidence or whatever it might be, but not responding in the moment to what pupils are actually showing you and significantly adapting your lessons. Caveat to that, of course, is thinking about my own experiences. It might be the case that the teachers in question were a bit more reluctant to go off piste because someone else was in their room, and that's, so it's you have to I always have to like dig a bit further in conversations to get teachers to open up a little bit and say, yeah, to be honest, I would have done something different if you weren't here. But often that isn't the case. So I do think that kind of the basics of responsive teaching are often like the most common things that I see experienced teachers working on.
Yeah, big time. I think that's a big part of any CPD curriculum is the idea of responsiveness and those sort of systems we can put in place in our own classes that we've talked about on the podcast. I mean, that behavior one, I will, if I'm modeling with someone and say it's their turn, like I will gradually split the teaching. So I'll start off, I'll do 100% of the first lesson. By the end of the 21 lessons, say they'll be doing 100%. And if I see a teacher allowing the pupils to talk over them, I will stop and say, no, you need to have respect for yourself by insisting that the pupils have respect for you and your voice is valid. And the pupils hear this and they realize, well, this is why we have to do this. And then they'll, I think, typically conform. But it's not one you can let go until the session afterwards when we're talking with them. I think, because then it could be a whole lesson of that. And that's when you lose the sort of critical mass behavior wise, because then people think, well, it's okay to talk over this person. But at the very least, every word you say should be important to those pupils. So they need to be listening, don't they?
If you'll forgive a little bit of a hot take based on what you said there and based on this conversation more generally, I reckon that any school that gets behavior in a pretty good place and gets teachers habitually assessing and responding to their pupils in lesson, I think almost every school that does that is in a really good place and is significantly above average, just because those two things sound quite simple but are really difficult to achieve. And so often you hear about, I have conversations with Sylvia about her secondary school and the ones that she works in, and when periods of time when they're in a good place and when they're not. And so often when they're in a good place, it's just, oh yeah, behavior's in a good place. And I know that the people in my department are really good when it comes to actually responding to what kids are showing them in the classroom. And from my experience of a fair few primary classrooms, I think the same is probably true at primary as well. If your teachers are genuinely responding and behavior is good, you're almost certainly doing great stuff.
And that might be the first hot take on the podcast. So thank you for that, Chris.
Well, I think there's been plenty of hot takes. I think that was the first time that someone openly described it as a hot take. Well, because you know me, culturally, finger on the button. This expression "hot take" has, only really been popular in the last, 35 years or so.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, we've gone longer than we said we would, so I really appreciate your time, Chris. Always really interesting. I really like the quality of your questions. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot with the technology question, but I do want to survey as many people as possible because I think it's a very important question because of the money that will be spent over the next couple of decades on technology in the classroom. But all I said to do is say thank you for joining me. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Kieran. Always a pleasure.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.